In a small, divided town nestled between open fields and forgotten factories lived a boy named Malik. The town was called Greyridge, a place where time seemed to stand still and where the line between us and them had been drawn long before Malik was born. To the people on the wealthier side of town, Malik was a troublemaker, a thug, someone to be feared before he was even known. But to his neighbors, he was just a young man trying to survive, carrying the weight of labels he never deserved. Malik grew up in the old brick apartments near the industrial district, where the paint peeled from the walls and the air carried the faint scent of smoke. His mother worked 2 jobs, cleaning houses in the very neighborhoods that looked down on them. His father had passed away when he was 10, a factory accident that no one outside their block seemed to care about. The official report said it was worker negligence, but everyone in the community knew it was the company's faulty equipment that killed him. Still, no justice ever came. That was Malik's first lesson about how the world worked for people like him. From a young age, Malik felt the invisible chains of judgment. Teachers watched him closely, store clerks followed him through aisles, and police cruisers slowed down when he walked by. He was tall, strong, and dark-skinned, enough to make people nervous for reasons they could never quite explain. No matter what he did, he was always someone's suspect. Yet, Malik was far from the stereotype they painted him to be. When he wasn't helping his mother, he spent his time repairing bicycles for neighborhood kids or volunteering at the youth center his father once helped build. He had a natural gift for fixing things, machines, engines, anything broken. Maybe it was his way of healing the world one small piece at a time. But the world rarely noticed. To them, his hoodie and quiet nature made him a threat, not a helper. One rainy afternoon, everything began to change. Malik was on his way home from the auto shop where he worked part-time. His hands were stained with grease, his clothes damp from the downpour. He passed through the main square, where a group of local teenagers from the wealthier part of town stood under an awning, laughing and joking. They were his age, but lived in a completely different world. As Malik walked by, one of them shouted a word that sliced through the rain like a blade. A word loaded with hate and history. Others laughed. Malik kept walking, his jaw tight, his pulse steady. He had learned long ago that reacting would only make things worse. But as he passed, someone threw a soda can that hit his back. The laughter grew louder. The world watched, and no one spoke up. He didn't stop. He didn't turn. But inside, something shifted. That moment would stay with him for years, a symbol of everything wrong with the way people saw him. Later that night, as Malik sat by his window listening to the storm, the lights flickered and went out across the neighborhood. A power outage, nothing new in Greyridge. But when he looked toward the hills on the other side of town, he saw darkness there too. For the first time in years, the entire town, rich and poor alike, had gone dark together. At first, it was just an inconvenience. But then, word began to spread through the local radio a gas leak had been detected near the old factory district, where the chemical plant stored flammable materials. If the leak reached the power station, the result could be catastrophic. The entire town was at risk of an explosion. Malik's heart pounded as he looked toward the distant towers of the plant, faintly visible through the rain. He knew that plant well. His father had worked there. He knew its layout, its systems, its flaws. The thought struck him like lightning. He might be the only one who could stop what was coming. The roads were already flooded, and the emergency crews hadn't arrived yet. The town's response was slow, unprepared. Malik grabbed his raincoat and his father's old toolbox and ran out into the storm. As he reached the plant gates, the air smelled of gas and smoke. He could hear the faint hiss of a leak somewhere inside. The security lights were out, the gates locked. He climbed over the fence, ignoring the sharp metal cutting into his palms. Inside, the machinery groaned like a wounded beast. He followed the sound of leaking gas to one of the main pipelines, the very one his father had once complained about before the accident. The bolts were loose, the valves corroded. It was only a matter of time before pressure built up enough to ignite. Malik knew what he had to do. Working quickly, he used the tools he had learned to handle since he was a boy, tightening, sealing, and rerouting the flow. The rain poured harder, mixing with oil and dirt beneath his feet. His hands trembled, not from fear, but from urgency. He could already hear sirens in the distance. Minutes felt like hours. The gas leak slowed, then stopped. The hiss faded into silence. Malik exhaled, his chest heaving with exhaustion and relief. He had done it. He had prevented a disaster that could have destroyed the entire town. But as the emergency crews arrived, they didn't see a hero. They saw a black teenager drenched in rain standing near a restricted industrial site. The officers shouted, drew their weapons, and surrounded him. He raised his hands, shouting over the storm, trying to explain. But no one was listening. The sirens drowned out his words. The flashlights blinded him. The hands that grabbed him were cold and rough. And as they pinned him to the ground, Malik's toolbox fell open, spilling his father's old tools across the wet concrete. The officers didn't care. To them, it was just another criminal caught in the act. As they led him away, the plant workers discovered what he had done: the sealed pipe, the repaired valve, the halted gas leak. But the truth would take time to surface. For now, the boy they called a thug was handcuffed in the rain, accused of breaking into the very place he had just saved. And as the storm raged on over Grey Ridge, Malik's story was about to become something no one in that town would ever forget. The next few weeks unfolded like a slow storm, one that didn't roar or rage but crept quietly into every corner of Malik's life. It was the kind of storm built not from thunder, but from whispers, from the looks that lingered too long, from the casual suspicion that followed him wherever he went. Ever since the incident at the grocery store, the one where a simple misunderstanding had spiraled into public humiliation, Malik's name had begun to spread. Not as a person, but as a warning. To the locals, he was no longer Malik Johnson, the young man who fixed engines for free, who helped old Mrs. Carver carry groceries up the hill, or who spent evenings teaching kids how to repair bicycles behind his uncle's auto shop. He was just that guy, the one who looked like trouble. It didn't matter that he had done nothing wrong. In the eyes of the town, his skin and his size told the whole story. Every morning when he walked to work, people crossed the street. Mothers pulled their children closer. Shop owners watched him from behind glass windows as if waiting for him to prove them right. He felt it. The invisible wall between him and everyone else, built from fear, ignorance, and generations of quiet prejudice. At first, he tried to ignore it. He told himself that hard work would change their minds, that kindness would undo suspicion. But it was never enough. Every small act of goodwill vanished beneath the shadow of their bias. When the police drove by, they slowed down. When something was stolen, eyes turned his way. His boss at the mechanic shop, Mr. Dempsey, was one of the few who treated him fairly. Or at least, that's what Malik believed at first. Dempsey had hired him right after high school, impressed by his natural skill with machines. But lately, Malik noticed a shift. Fewer hours, fewer smiles, more reminders to keep his hands visible when customers were around. More quiet warnings to stay out of trouble. One afternoon, as Malik was closing up shop, he overheard two of his coworkers talking in low voices near the back. They didn't know he could hear them. Their words cut sharper than any knife. They joked that Dempsey only hired him because of some tax benefit. They laughed about how guys like him always ended up in jail or on the news. And when one of them said, "He looks like he could rob the place if he wanted," the other didn't disagree. Malik didn't say a word. He just finished sweeping the floor, locked the doors, and walked home under the fading sun, each step heavier than the last. The world had drawn its lines around him, and no matter how hard he tried to erase them, they reappeared. Darker, bolder, more permanent. At home, the silence was his only comfort. His small apartment was sparse but clean, filled with the scent of motor oil and the hum of an old radio. It was the one place where he didn't have to prove anything. Still, even there, he could feel the weight of what people saw when they looked at him. Not a man, but a stereotype. He thought often of his late mother, who had raised him to believe in decency, faith, and forgiveness. She used to tell him that hate was a reflection, not a truth, that what people see in you is often what they fear in themselves. But those words were harder to hold on to now, especially when every door seemed to close a little tighter each day. Things got worse when a series of break-ins began around town. Small stores, gas stations, and even a church were hit. The real culprit was never caught, but suspicion spread like wildfire, and Malik, with his quiet demeanor and dark hoodie, became the face of every rumor. He could feel it in every glance, every muttered comment. The sheriff, a heavy-set man named Whittaker, even stopped by the shop one morning, just to ask a few questions. It wasn't an arrest, not officially, but everyone saw. Everyone whispered. By the time the sun went down, Malik's reputation had been decided. The truth didn't matter. In a town ruled by assumptions, guilt required no evidence. Yet, even as his world grew smaller, Malik refused to give in. He showed up to work on time. He helped when he could. He smiled when it hurt. He carried himself with quiet dignity, the kind that no lie could destroy. Then, one night, everything changed. A thunderstorm rolled through the valley, one of the worst in years. Rain fell in sheets, lightning cracked across the hills, and wind howled through the streets. Malik stayed late at the shop, making sure the vehicles parked outside were secured. When he finally stepped out, soaked and shivering, he noticed something strange. Water pooling in places it shouldn't. He followed the trail down the street, past the post office, until he reached the small river that ran along the edge of town. What he saw made his heart drop. The river had risen dangerously high, almost touching the bridge. And further up, in the distance, he could make out the outline of the old dam, a relic from the 1950s, long neglected, its concrete walls darkened by time and weather. It wasn't supposed to look like that. Cracks lined its base, and water was spilling through. Malik felt a surge of panic. He knew what that meant. He had read about dams collapsing, seen the documentaries, how an old structure like that could crumble under pressure, how an entire town could be swept away in minutes. He pulled out his phone and called the emergency line, trying to report what he saw. But the operator on the other end seemed skeptical, brushing off his warning. She said the city engineers had inspected the dam months ago, that it was structurally sound. When Malik insisted that something was wrong, her tone shifted. Cautious, doubtful, patronizing. She asked for his name. When he told her, the silence on the other end told him everything. "Someone will look into it," she said flatly, before ending the call. Malik stood there in the rain, staring at the dam as another crack widened. He realized then that no one was coming. Not because they didn't care, but because they didn't believe him. And if he didn't act soon, the town that had labeled him a menace would be gone by morning. He looked down the hill at the sleeping lights of the town. The homes, the families, the same people who crossed the street when he walked by. They didn't trust him. They didn't respect him. But they were still his people. The wind howled louder, and thunder rolled across the sky. Malik took a deep breath, eyes fixed on the dam. He knew what he had to do. He couldn't wait for anyone else. And as he began to climb the muddy road toward the crumbling structure, lightning split the sky in two, casting his silhouette against the storm. A lone figure walking straight into danger for a town that never saw his worth. The rain swallowed him whole, and the valley echoed with the sound of rushing water. For Jamal, life in Ridgefield had always been a tightrope walk, every step taken under the watchful eyes of people who had already made up their minds about who he was. After the fire at the community center, the whispers started small, curling through alleys and grocery store lines, growing louder each day until they filled every corner of the town. He didn't need to hear his name to know they were talking about him. He could feel it in the way people paused when he entered a room, in the way their eyes hardened with something between fear and disdain. The investigation into the fire was still ongoing, but most of Ridgefield didn't need proof. They already had their culprit, the troubled young man, with tattoos, the one who played loud music and wore a hoodie even in the heat, the one who had once gotten into a fight defending himself outside a gas station years ago. In their minds, Jamal fit the picture perfectly. He noticed the change immediately. The woman who always smiled at him at the coffee shop now avoided eye contact. The hardware store clerk who used to greet him with a friendly nod now watched him carefully, as though waiting for him to steal something. Even the kids at the park seemed to have absorbed the unspoken tension, their parents calling them back whenever Jamal came near. But what hurt most wasn't the strangers. It was seeing people he had grown up with, classmates, neighbors, even teachers, look at him like a threat, like the kid they once knew had been replaced by a dangerous stranger. The same hands that used to pat his shoulder now clutched their purses or crossed their arms when he passed. Despite it all, Jamal tried to keep his head down. He went to work, helped his mother with repairs around the house, and volunteered at the local youth center. It was ironic, he thought, that the same community that now saw him as dangerous had once praised him for trying to guide younger kids away from trouble. But all of that goodwill had vanished with the smoke from the fire. One afternoon, as he was leaving work, he noticed a police cruiser parked across the street. It wasn't unusual. Ridgefield wasn't a big town. But this one didn't move. Its engine idled, and the officer inside seemed to be watching him. Jamal ignored it, but when it happened again the next day, and again the day after that, the unease began to settle deep in his chest. He tried to shake it off. Maybe he was being paranoid. Maybe it was coincidence. But deep down, he knew better. He had seen this before. The way suspicion turned into surveillance, and how easily that could turn into something worse. The following week, a notice went up at the community bulletin board. It was from the Ridgefield Gazette, a short article about the fire. The headline read, "Police investigate possible arson. Locals demand answers." There were no names mentioned, but the comments online told the real story. Anonymous posts flooded the town's social media groups. "We all know who did it," one read. "He's been trouble since high school," another said. Others were more venomous, filled with racial slurs and accusations that cut deeper than any fire ever could. Jamal didn't respond. He didn't defend himself. What was the point? He had learned long ago that defending yourself only made you look guilty to people who wanted to see you that way. Instead, he buried himself in work. His boss, Mr. Ramirez, was one of the few people who still treated him the same. He gave Jamal extra hours at the construction site, trusting him with tasks that required precision and care. Jamal threw himself into it, hammering nails, pouring concrete, building something tangible when the rest of his life felt like it was crumbling. But no amount of hard work could fix what was breaking around him. One evening, as he was walking home, he saw smoke again, this time from the direction of the old warehouse near the train tracks. Sirens wailed moments later, and soon police cars and fire trucks filled the street. The warehouse, long abandoned and used mostly by homeless folks for shelter, was engulfed in flames. Jamal stood frozen, watching as the fire lit up the night sky. And then, as if scripted by fate, someone pointed toward him. A group of onlookers had gathered nearby, and their murmurs turned quickly to accusations. "He's here again," someone whispered. Another voice shouted, "What's he doing there?" Before he knew it, two officers were walking toward him, their flashlights cutting through the smoke. They questioned him briefly, their tone clipped and suspicious. Though they didn't arrest him, the message was clear. They saw him not as a witness, but as a suspect. That night, Jamal sat in his small room, staring at the calloused palms of his hands. Hands that had built, repaired, helped, now branded by suspicion. He felt a familiar ache deep inside him, the kind that came from years of being judged by things he couldn't change. His skin, his background, his past. Still, he refused to let anger consume him. Anger was what they expected. Instead, he began thinking of ways to prove his innocence. Not just to the police, but to the town itself. He began looking into the fires, visiting the sites, talking quietly to anyone who might have seen something. He learned that several properties targeted for development had recently burned down, all owned by the same investment group trying to buy land cheap. Something about it didn't add up. Jamal realized that maybe the real culprit wasn't some reckless kid. It was someone profiting from destruction. Someone who had more to gain from the fires than anyone else. He started documenting what he found, photos, patterns. The pieces slowly began to connect. And though it wasn't proof yet, it was enough to give him hope. For the first time in weeks, he felt a flicker of purpose again. But as he dug deeper, strange things began happening. His car tires were slashed one morning. Anonymous letters appeared on his doorstep, warning him to stay out of things that don't concern him. Someone even broke into his shed, scattering his notes. The message was clear. Someone didn't want him uncovering the truth. Jamal stood at a crossroads. He could back off, protect himself, and let the town keep believing he was the villain. Or he could keep pushing, risk everything, and expose whoever was really behind the fires. As he sat alone in the dark, the sound of sirens echoing faintly in the distance, Jamal made his choice. He wouldn't let fear silence him. Not this time. Because if Ridgefield was going to see him as a thug, then he would show them what that word really meant. Strength, resilience, and courage in the face of injustice. He didn't know it yet, but the next step he took toward uncovering the truth would change everything. For him, and for the town that had already written his story before he had the chance to tell it. And somewhere in the shadows, the real arsonist was watching him, planning their next move. The town of Brookfield had grown used to quiet evenings. The kind of stillness that carried the hum of crickets, the faint glow of porch lights, and the illusion of peace. But one night, that illusion shattered. It began with a flicker, a power surge that plunged the east side into darkness. Then came the smell of smoke. It drifted through the air like an omen, curling into homes, creeping into lungs. By the time the first alarms blared, flames were already tearing through the abandoned warehouse near the river, the one that sat dangerously close to the town's fuel depot. The fire spread faster than anyone could react. Wind whipped through the open fields, feeding the inferno until it roared like a living beast. The streets filled with chaos. Families fled their homes, clutching their children, faces streaked with soot and terror. Fire trucks screamed down the roads, but the hydrants in the area were old, rusted, barely functional. Panic took hold, and amid that chaos stood Marcus, the same man many in town had crossed the street to avoid. The one whispered about, judged for his tattoos, his hoodies, his quiet, intimidating presence. To them Marcus was a thug, someone to fear, not trust. But tonight, none of that mattered. He had been working late at the community center, patching walls and repainting classrooms for the after-school program he started, a project no one in town had volunteered to help with. When the lights went out, he stepped outside, saw the orange glow rising over the rooftops, and heard the distant screams. Without hesitation, he ran toward the danger. The air grew thick with ash. Sirens wailed from every direction. Marcus's lungs burned as he sprinted down the street, past houses he once mowed lawns for, past the shop that refused to hire him, past the people who had called him names when he was a teenager. None of that mattered now. He reached the depot just as the first explosion rocked the ground. A smaller one, thank God, but enough to send debris flying. The firefighters were overwhelmed. They shouted orders, but their hoses barely reached. They were running out of water pressure, and the wind was shifting, carrying embers toward the residential area. The town could lose everything within the hour. Marcus's eyes darted toward the river, only 100 yards away. The old irrigation channel he used to swim in as a kid still connected to the depot's rear. It was risky, but if he could redirect the flow, maybe it could help slow the flames. He grabbed what tools he could find, a rusted wrench, a broken shovel, and made his way to the riverbank. The mud was slick, and the heat pressed down like a weight, but he pushed on. Every muscle screamed, but he kept digging, forcing open the old drainage pipes that had been sealed off for years. Behind him, the fire drew closer. The sound was monstrous, a deep, hungry roar. Yet amid that chaos, Marcus worked with relentless focus. The firefighters saw him, shouting for him to get back, but he didn't stop. When the first gush of water burst through the reopened channel, it cut through the dirt like a lifeline. The stream spread, wetting the perimeter, creating a barrier that slowed the flames from leaping toward the houses. For the first time that night, there was hope. But as he turned to move, another explosion hit, this one larger, throwing him backward. Pain shot through his leg, the world spun. Smoke filled his lungs, and everything blurred into gray and orange. He crawled, dragging himself behind a fallen beam, and coughed until he could breathe again. He could hear people yelling now, firefighters, residents, maybe even his name. He wasn't sure. By the time they reached him, he had passed out. His body was covered in soot, his hands burned raw. But he was alive, and because of his quick thinking, the fire had been contained before it reached the homes. The town would wake up shaken, scarred, but still standing. The news spread fast, first among the rescue teams, then through the neighbors who watched from their windows. The thug they once avoided had saved their town. Some refused to believe it at first. Others stayed silent, ashamed. But for those who had seen him that night, covered in smoke, limping through fire to help them, there was no denying what they witnessed. As Marcus lay unconscious in the hospital, the same people who once whispered about him now filled the waiting room. The mayor called an emergency meeting to discuss the incident. Reporters began arriving, and the community's guilt hung heavy in the air. For the first time in years, Brookfield wasn't talking about Marcus in fear or disgust. They were talking about him with awe, confusion, and a dawning sense of remorse. But Marcus didn't know any of that yet. He was still fighting to wake up, unaware that his life, and the town's perception of him, had just changed forever. When the doctor entered the room, her expression was serious. The damage to his leg was extensive, and recovery would be slow. But the greater threat was the smoke inhalation. His lungs were struggling, and the next few days would determine everything. Outside his room, a man stood silently. The same man who had once called Marcus a menace to society. The same man who had demanded Marcus be banned from the community center. Now he stood there, hat in hand, guilt painted across his face, staring at the unconscious hero. He wanted to apologize, but how do you apologize to someone you'd already condemned? That night, the town held its breath. The streets were still scorched, the air heavy with the smell of burned metal and ash. But for the first time, Brookfield wasn't defined by its prejudice. It was united in its hope that the man they had misjudged would live. And as the lights in the hospital dimmed and the machines hummed steadily, Marcus's fingers twitched. A sign of life. A sign that this story wasn't over yet, because what came next would change not only how the town saw him, but how it saw itself. The storm rolled in like a living beast, swallowing the horizon with sheets of dark clouds and flickering lightning that split the sky in violent bursts. Rain began to fall in thick, punishing drops, the kind that made the streets glisten like rivers of glass. By nightfall, the town was unrecognizable. Power lines snapped under the pressure of the wind, and trees bowed in surrender. Deshawn was sitting in his small apartment, staring at the candlelight trembling against the wall. He had finished a long shift at the auto shop and was bone-tired. But something in the air felt wrong, heavier than the usual storms they got every few years. Then, through the roar of the wind, came the sound of distant sirens and a low rumble that didn't belong to thunder. Moments later, the radio static broke with a trembling voice announcing a state of emergency. The dam upstream had cracked under pressure. If it burst, the entire lower side of town, where most of the poorer, marginalized families lived, would be submerged within hours. Deshawn froze. He remembered the dam. His father used to take him fishing near it before life had hardened him. The dam had always seemed indestructible, a wall of power, holding back chaos. But now, chaos was coming. He grabbed his jacket and flashlight. His mother's old words echoed in his head, never wait for others to save you. Sometimes, you have to save them. By the time he reached the main street, panic had already taken hold. People were running, clutching children, bags, pets, anything they could carry. The town's emergency vehicles were overwhelmed. The police were trying to maintain control, shouting orders through bullhorns, but the fear was stronger than authority. Deshawn noticed the familiar faces of people who had once crossed the street to avoid him, the same ones who whispered, "Thug," behind his back when he walked by. But in this moment, labels didn't matter. Water didn't care about race, reputation, or rumor. It would take everyone the same. Without hesitation, he ran toward the fire station where volunteers were gathering. Inside, chaos reigned. One of the fire trucks had stalled, and a roadblock was preventing rescue crews from reaching the lower district, the part of town where most of the black and immigrant families lived. The dispatcher's voice crackled through the radio. "We can't reach them. Roads are flooded. We're pulling back." Deshawn's hands tightened around his flashlight. Pulling back meant abandoning his people. The families who couldn't afford to move uphill. The kids who played basketball on cracked courts. The mothers who worked double shifts. He grabbed a set of waders and a reflective vest from a hook. No one stopped him. They were too busy. He didn't ask for permission. He just went. As he stepped out into the storm, the water was already knee-deep. He could barely see through the rain, but he knew the route by memory. Years of walking those streets had etched them into his bones. He pushed forward, his breath coming in bursts as wind whipped his face. At the corner of Maple and 3rd, he found an overturned car. Inside was a woman pounding at the window, trapped. Deshawn used a crowbar from his bag to shatter the glass and pull her out. She looked at him terrified, but when she saw who he was, her expression changed. Recognition, shock. Then something softer. He didn't wait for thanks. There was no time. He continued deeper into the flooding streets, moving from house to house, shouting instructions, breaking doors when necessary, pulling families onto rooftops and trees. With every rescue, his body grew heavier, but his resolve only deepened. When he reached the school, the same school where, years ago, he had been humiliated by teachers and classmates who assumed the worst about him, he found it filled with families seeking refuge. The roof was leaking, but it was higher ground. He broke open the gym's emergency supplies and guided everyone inside. Outside, the dam's roar grew louder. The final barrier was failing. And then, with a thunderous crack that echoed across the valley, the dam burst. A wall of water surged down the valley like an unstoppable monster, devouring everything in its path. Deshaun had seconds to act. He climbed onto the roof and waved his flashlight toward a helicopter in the distance, signaling the location of the survivors. The pilot circled once, then dropped a ladder. One by one, families were lifted to safety. Children, mothers, elderly, everyone except Deshaun. He stayed behind, helping the last group climb up. The floodwaters rose to his waist, then his chest. The helicopter pilot shouted, but Deshaun shook his head. He wasn't done. He turned and saw one last house at the end of the street, lights still flickering inside. He recognized it, the old mayor's house, the same man who had once called him a stain on this town. The man was trapped on the second floor, clutching his injured leg. Deshaun didn't think. He dove into the icy current, fighting against the pool, every muscle screaming. He reached the house, climbed the railing, and broke through the window. The man looked at him, disbelief frozen on his face, but Deshaun just lifted him, dragging him toward the rescue point. The helicopter returned, lowering the ladder again. The mayor went up first, coughing and shaking. When Deshaun finally grabbed the bottom rung, his strength began to fade. The storm screamed around him, wind tearing at his jacket, but he kept climbing until hands pulled him aboard. He collapsed on the floor of the chopper, drenched, exhausted, and trembling. Below, the town was drowning, but hundreds of lives were now safe because of him. When they landed at the evacuation center, people stared as he stepped off the helicopter. The same faces that had once looked at him with suspicion were now filled with awe and gratitude. Children pointed, whispering his name. Mothers cried and thanked God, but Deshaun didn't seek attention. He simply stood there, watching the sunrise break through the storm's aftermath. For the first time, the light touched the town without prejudice, illuminating the ruins, yes, but also the unity born out of survival. He didn't know yet that this night would change everything. That news crews would call him a hero. That the same police chief who once profiled him would now stand before cameras praising his bravery. All he knew was that something had shifted. Not just in the town, but inside him. He had spent years trying to prove he wasn't who they said he was. But now, he didn't need to prove anything. The truth had spoken louder than any defense. And yet, as the sound of helicopters faded and emergency sirens died down, Deshaun saw something in the distance. A group of men whispering, their faces tight with resentment. Not everyone was happy, because for some, no amount of heroism could erase their prejudice. And as Deshaun turned away, exhausted but unbroken, he knew this wasn't the end. The storm may have passed, but another one, silent, human, and more dangerous, was just beginning. The morning dawned gray and heavy, as if the sky itself knew that something was coming. The air was thick with tension, the kind that seeps into every corner of a small town before disaster strikes. Malik stood by the window of his small workshop, watching clouds roll over the hills. It had been a week since the first cracks appeared in the old dam that loomed above the town, and no one had done anything about it. He had reported it to the authorities, warned them that the structure was unsafe, but his concerns were dismissed like a nuisance. They didn't trust the word of a man like him. A young black mechanic with tattoos and a past he couldn't escape. They called him a thug, a troublemaker, and a nobody. He'd learned to stop expecting people to listen. But that morning, as the first rumble of thunder rolled through the valley, Malik felt something deep in his chest, an instinct that something was very, very wrong. Rain began to pour in sheets, drenching the town within minutes. The streets filled with water, drains clogged, and the river that flowed from the dam began to swell. People hurried into shops, clutching umbrellas, complaining about the storm without realizing the true danger that loomed above them. Up at the dam, the old concrete structure groaned under the pressure of rising water. Cracks widened, forming spiderwebs across its surface. Malik's warning had not been paranoia, it had been prophecy. By noon, panic began to spread. A low, unearthly sound echoed across the valley, the sound of breaking stone. The dam had fractured. The first gush of water burst through the cracks, roaring like thunder, tearing through the hillside. Within minutes, the alarm sirens blared through town, warning of an imminent flood. Malik didn't hesitate. While others scrambled to save their possessions, he jumped into his truck and sped toward the dam. His tires cut through the flooded streets as people yelled for him to turn back, to save himself. But he couldn't. He had seen the town through too much. The racism, the suspicion, the hate, but this was still his home. These were still his people, even if they had never seen him as theirs. As he drove, memories flashed through his mind. The times he was stopped by police for fitting a description. The whispers when he walked into stores. The parents who pulled their children closer when he passed. Every insult, every look, every door slammed in his face. They had built walls around his heart. But now, in this moment, all he wanted was to save them. The road up to the dam was almost impassable, flooded and strewn with debris. Malik abandoned the truck halfway and climbed the rest on foot, rain soaking through his clothes. When he reached the top, the sight stole his breath. A massive section of the dam had collapsed, and water was pouring through like a beast unleashed. The emergency crew had not yet arrived. There was no one else there. He could see the town below, small and fragile against the incoming torrent. If the dam gave way completely, it would destroy everything: the homes, the schools, the people. There was only one thing he could do. Malik ran to the control shed, where the old floodgates could be manually opened to divert water to the eastern valley, an uninhabited area. It would buy the town time, but the system was ancient, jammed from years of neglect. He pulled at the lever, muscles straining, hands bleeding as the metal refused to move. The sound of cracking concrete grew louder behind him. Time was running out. Down below, the townspeople began to realize the scale of what was happening. The sheriff tried to organize an evacuation, but chaos reigned. People screamed, cars stalled, and the rain made everything worse. Somewhere among them, a child cried out for their parents. And that sound, faint but desperate, echoed up to where Malik stood. It gave him strength. With a final, desperate pull, he forced the lever down. The mechanism groaned, then shifted. The floodgates opened with a thunderous roar, sending part of the raging water into the eastern valley. It wasn't enough to stop the flood entirely, but it slowed it, gave the people below a fighting chance. But the force of the release destabilized the structure further. A deafening crack split the air. The dam shuddered violently. Malik turned toward the town one last time, watching the lights flicker in the storm. He thought of his mother, who had always told him that good deeds mattered, even when no one saw them, even when people hated you for who you were. And then, the dam gave way. When the storm had finally passed, rescue teams arrived. They found devastation: houses flattened, cars overturned, streets buried in mud. But they also found survivors, dozens of them. The water had diverted just enough to save the heart of the town. Families clung to each other, trembling but alive. When they reached the dam site, they found what was left of Malik's truck, half buried in debris. Nearby, they found him, lifeless, his hand still gripping the rusted control lever. He had stayed until the very end. News spread fast. At first there was disbelief. The same people who had called him dangerous, who had crossed the street to avoid him, now stood in silence as they learned that he had died saving them. The local paper ran a story the next morning. Local mechanic sacrifices himself to save hundreds. But the headline couldn't capture the change that rippled through the town. For the first time, they spoke his name, Malik Johnson, not as a threat, but as a hero. Murals were painted, memorials were built, and the same police chief who had once arrested him for loitering now stood in front of a crowd struggling to hold back tears as he honored Malik's bravery. The town that had judged him finally understood what kind of man he truly was. Not a thug, not a troublemaker, a savior. Months later, the rebuilt dam was renamed the Malik Johnson Memorial Dam. His workshop was preserved, his name etched into the walls of the community center he had once been excluded from. Children grew up learning his story, the man who gave his life to protect those who never accepted him. And in the quiet moments, when rain falls against the valley and the water runs calm again, the people of that town remember him. Some whisper prayers, others simply bow their heads. Because in the end, Malik's legacy wasn't just in the lives he saved, it was in the hearts he changed. He had shown them that true strength isn't about how loud you are or how much power you hold. It's about how far you're willing to go for others, even when they don't deserve it. And as the years passed, the town stood as a living reminder of the truth they had learned too late, that sometimes the people we judge the hardest are the ones who carry the greatest light. The thug they once feared had become the guardian angel of their town.